best part about watching my director's face go completely pale wasn't the number on the offer letter. Though $290,000 a year tends to have that effect on a room, it was the fact that she'd handed me the moment herself in front of 42 people on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to take it back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up about 18 months. I'd been with Meridian Consulting Group for 6 years when my director, let's call her my director because that's what she was, and that's all she deserves to be called, got promoted into a newly created role overseeing our entire operations division. Before that, she'd been a project coordinator in the financial services practice. Good at spreadsheets, excellent at meetings, had never, as far as I could tell, actually fixed anything broken in the real world. But she had a way of presenting that made leadership feel like things were under control. In consulting, sometimes that's enough to move up a floor. I'm a process optimization specialist, have been for over a decade. What that means, practically speaking, is that companies hire us to go inside their operations, figure out where time and money are leaking out, and design systems that stop the bleeding. It's not glamorous work. It involves a lot of time in warehouses and back offices and on factory floors, talking to the people who actually do the job every day. Those conversations are where the real answers live, not in the software dashboards, not in the quarterly reports, in the guy who's been loading the same dock for 11 years and knows exactly why Tuesday shipments always run late. My biggest client at the time was a mid-sized logistics company based in Mississauga. They moved freight across southern Ontario, up through the corridor to Ottawa and into Quebec. About 230 employees. Good people. Owner named Victor had built it from a single truck in 1997, and he was proud of that, as he should have been. But the company had grown faster than its systems, and by the time I came in, they were bleeding somewhere in the range of $400,000 a year in preventable inefficiencies. Missed delivery windows triggering penalty clauses. Fuel waste from routing that hadn't been updated since the Harper years. Driver overtime that was costing them extra but not producing extra output. I spent the first 3 months just watching. That's the part nobody likes to hear about. Clients want solutions in week 2. My director wanted solutions in week 2. But you can't fix what you don't understand, and understanding takes time. I drove routes with drivers. I sat in dispatch at 5 in the morning. I mapped every single touch point between when an order came in and when it got delivered. And I documented what broke down and where and why. By month 4, I had a picture. And it was detailed. We're talking over 300 pages of analysis, 47 process maps, cost per route breakdowns for their entire network. The root problem wasn't what anyone had assumed. It wasn't the drivers. It wasn't even the routing software. Though that needed updating, the core issue was that their dispatching decisions were being made in isolation from their warehouse loading sequence, which meant trucks were being sent out in an order that made sense on a map but made no sense given what was actually on them. They were backtracking. Every single day, across the entire fleet. When I brought Victor and his operations team the initial findings, the room went quiet for about 30 seconds. Then his operations manager, a former truck driver named Ken, who'd been with Victor since the beginning, leaned back in his chair and said, "We've been telling head office this for 4 years. Victor looked at Ken. Ken looked at me, and I said, "I know, it's in my notes." That moment mattered. It wasn't just about the analysis. It was about the fact that I'd listened to the right people and come back with proof that they'd been right all along. After that, Victor's team opened every door I needed. I had access to their full data systems, their dispatch logs going back 7 years, their fuel receipts, their penalty records, everything. The solution I designed wasn't a software switch. It was a sequencing protocol that coordinated dispatch decisions with loading order in real time. A set of route optimization parameters built specifically around their network rather than a generic algorithm, and a training program for their dispatch team so the new system would actually stick. I estimated implementation would take about 6 weeks and cost roughly $80,000. The projected annual savings were $430,000. Return on investment inside 3 months. I also billed more hours than originally scoped. That part matters. so I want to be clear about it. I'd estimated the engagement at 16 weeks. I ran 22. The extra 6 weeks weren't because I was slow. They were because the problem was deeper than the initial scoping had suggested, and doing it right required the additional time. The extra hours translated to roughly $60,000 in additional fees. But those fees were connected to work that was going to save Victor's company over $400,000 annually. That's not a rounding error. That's a real return, documented and defensible. I submitted everything to my director for review before the final client presentation. Full report, all supporting documentation, cost-benefit analysis, implementation plan. This was standard process. She reviewed it over a weekend. Monday morning, she called me into her office. She didn't ask about the findings. She didn't ask about the client relationship or the implementation timeline. The first thing she said was, "You went 6 weeks over scope and $60,000 over budget, and I need to understand why." I explained it exactly as I just explained it to you. The problem was larger than scoped. The additional work was justified by the outcomes. The client had been kept informed throughout and had approved the extended engagement in writing. She looked at me like I'd told her the moon was made of cheese. "Our standard engagements don't work that way," she said. "We have approved methodologies for a reason. The 3 software platforms we're certified on have built-in benchmarks. If you'd used one of those, you'd have come in on time and on budget." I asked her which of the 3 certified platforms would have addressed a dispatch-to-loading sequencing problem in a network with Victor's specific route configuration and penalty structure. She told me that wasn't the point. I asked what the point was. She said the point is consistency and scalability. We can't have consultants going rogue on client engagements because they think they know better than the system. That word, rogue. I filed it away. Over the next several weeks, things got colder. She started copying herself on all of my client communications. She rerouted 2 smaller engagements I'd been staffed on to other consultants without explaining why. When I submitted the final client report for Victor's company, she sent it back with a note that said it needed to be reformatted according to the firm's standard template before it could go to the client. The standard template had been designed for software implementation projects. It had entire sections that didn't apply to what I'd done. Reformatting it would have meant stripping out roughly 60 pages of analysis that were critical to the client understanding both the findings and the rationale behind the solution. I told her this. She told me those were the firm's standards. I reformatted what I could without gutting the substance, and I flagged the sections I'd retained in a cover memo explaining why. She didn't respond to the memo. Victor's company implemented the protocol. By month 3 of implementation, they were tracking toward $380,000 in annual savings. Not $430,000, but still a number that made Victor very happy. He referred me to 2 colleagues. One ran a similar logistics operation out of Hamilton. The other was a manufacturing company in Cambridge that had a completely different set of problems, but had heard from Victor that I was the kind of consultant who actually fixed things rather than just writing reports about them. I brought both referrals to my director as new business leads. She thanked me in an email and assigned them to 2 other consultants on the team. That was in October. The annual review cycle started in November. My director submitted my performance review to HR before I'd had a chance to review it with her, which was not the process. When I got a copy, I found language describing my approach as non-collaborative, outside firm methodology, and resistant to standardized frameworks. There was no mention of the client outcomes, no mention of the referrals, no mention of the documented savings. I requested a meeting to discuss. She agreed. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. She spent most of it talking about the importance of scalable processes. I spent most of it trying to get her to engage with the actual results. She ended the meeting by saying, "I think we see this work differently, and that's something you're going to need to think about going forward." I thought about it a lot, and what I thought was that she was either afraid of what my approach revealed about the limitations of the firm's certified methodology, or she was protecting her own position by making sure none of her direct reports outshone the systems she'd been brought in to enforce. Maybe both. Either way, I wasn't going to change how I worked, because the way I worked produced results, and the clients knew it even if she didn't want to. January and February, I kept my head down and focused on a new engagement. a regional grocery distribution company out of Guelph that was struggling with their cold chain logistics. Good problem. Interesting work. I documented everything meticulously, stayed within the scoped timeline, and produced a preliminary analysis that I thought was some of the strongest work I'd done in years. The firm had a quarterly operations review in mid-March. All the senior consultants and directors, about 42 people in the main boardroom at our Toronto office. It was the kind of meeting where you presented your active engagements, flagged any issues, and discussed capacity planning for the next quarter. I'd been to a dozen of them. They were usually fine. I was scheduled to present the Guelph engagement midway through the agenda. I prepared a tight 20-minute overview. Clean slides, all the key findings from the preliminary analysis, the proposed methodology, a revised scope and budget, and early indicators that were already pointing toward significant savings potential. I had not prepared for what happened instead. My director opened the meeting. About 40 minutes in, before my slot on the agenda, she pivoted unexpectedly and said she wanted to take a few minutes to address some concerns about engagement methodology and resource allocation. She pulled up a slide. It had my name on it. It was a summary of my Victor engagement framed as a case study in what happens when a consultant deviates from approved methodology. Overscoped. Over budget. Custom approach that couldn't be replicated or scaled. There was no mention of the outcomes, no mention of the $400,000 in projected savings, no mention of the 2 referrals. Just the overages, presented like evidence. I sat there and listened to my director describe 18 months of my best work as a cautionary tale, in front of every senior colleague I had at that firm, including 2 partners I respected and one I'd been hoping would consider me for a senior role that was opening up in the fall. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "Do you have anything you want to add, or are we aligned on the concerns?" I was about to respond when my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it. Text message. Then it buzzed again. Then it rang. The caller ID said Fortis Logistics Group. I knew that name. They were one of the largest privately held freight and supply chain companies in Ontario. About 900 employees, headquartered in Brampton. I'd had a brief conversation with their VP of Operations at an industry event back in November. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about the kinds of problems I'd worked on. He'd taken my card. I hadn't heard from them since. I looked at my director. I looked at the phone. I picked it up. She started to say something. I held up one finger. The voice on the line was the VP. He got straight to the point. He'd been tracking the outcomes from my Meridian engagements through industry contacts, he said. He'd spoken with Victor. He'd spoken with one of the Hamilton referrals. He said his company had been looking for someone who could actually diagnose what was wrong with their operations rather than apply a template and call it done. He said they had a director of process innovation role that had been unfilled for 8 months because they couldn't find the right person. And then he said the number, $290,000 base. Signing bonus, full benefits, equity participation. I stood up from the table. Not to be dramatic, I genuinely needed to not be sitting down for that part of the conversation. I walked to the far side of the boardroom, which was glass on 3 sides, and I said, "Yes. I'm very interested. Can we speak in detail this afternoon?" He said yes. We set a time. I came back to the table. My director was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. The 41 other people in the room were very quiet. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "You were asking if we were aligned on the concerns." She nodded slowly. "I don't think we are," I said. "The engagement you described produced $380,000 in documented annual savings for the client. 2 referrals that became new business for this firm and a client relationship that's still active and expanding. None of that was in your slide. I think the people in this room should have the full picture." Nobody said anything for a moment. One of the partners, a woman who'd been at the firm for 20 years and who I'd always found to be straightforward and fair, said, "Can you walk us through the outcomes?" I did. It took about 8 minutes. I had it memorized. When I finished, the room was different. I could feel it. The other partner asked 2 questions. Both were genuine. The kind of questions you ask when you're actually trying to understand something. Not when you're trying to defend a position. My director didn't say much after that. The meeting continued. I gave my Guelph presentation. It went well. That afternoon, I spoke with the VP at Fortis for 90 minutes. 2 days later, I met their CEO and 2 members of their board at their Brampton office. The role was exactly what he'd described. They weren't looking for someone to implement a certification. They were looking for someone who could look at a complex operational problem, understand what was actually causing it, and build a solution that would last. They'd been burned twice by firms that had sold them software and called it strategy. They wanted something different. I accepted the offer the following week. I gave my 4 weeks' notice at Meridian. My director processed it without a conversation. I got a standard HR email with offboarding instructions. Fine. I hadn't expected anything else. What I hadn't expected was the call I got 3 days after I handed in my notice. It was from Victor. He'd heard through the industry that I was moving on. He wanted to congratulate me, but he also wanted to tell me something. He'd had a conversation the week before with one of the Meridian partners, the one who'd asked the 2 questions in the boardroom. She'd called to check in on the engagement and had asked directly about the extended scope and the additional fees. Victor had told her exactly what he told me 18 months ago when I first started working with his company, that the extra time had been necessary, that he'd approved it, that it had been worth every dollar, and that as far as he was concerned, I was the best consultant his company had ever worked with. He said the partner had thanked him and gotten quiet in a way that suggested she was learning something she hadn't known before. I don't know what happened internally at Meridian after I left. I don't know if my director faced any formal review or if the performance evaluation she'd submitted on me was revisited. It's not my business anymore, and honestly, it doesn't matter. I'm not the kind of person who needs to watch someone else fall to feel good about where I landed. What I know is this. I started at Fortis in May. By September, I'd identified and proposed solutions to 4 operational problems that are projected to save the company somewhere in the range of $1.2 million annually. I have a team of 6 now. 2 of them came from client-side operations backgrounds, which means they understand the work the same way I do. We don't use 3 approved platforms. We use whatever actually solves the problem. Last month, I ran into Ken, Victor's operations manager, at a logistics conference in Hamilton. He'd heard about the Fortis role. He shook my hand and said, "Always knew you'd end up somewhere worth your while." I thought about my director in her slide and the 42 people in that boardroom on a Tuesday in March. I thought about the phone ringing at exactly the right moment. I thought about how she'd handed me that moment without understanding what she was doing. And I thought about what I've learned in this work after all these years of going into broken systems and trying to understand them from the inside. The people who actually solve problems rarely look like they're following the rules. They look messy. They go over scope. They ask questions that make the room uncomfortable. But when the numbers come back, they're the ones in the room with something real to show. You don't build a reputation by staying inside the lines. You build it by doing the work that other people can't or won't do, and trusting that eventually the right people will notice. They did. I've thought a lot about that Tuesday afternoon since it happened. Not obsessively. I don't replay it looking for what I could have done differently. I replay it because it taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way. When my director stood up in that boardroom and used 18 months of my work as a slide in a cautionary tale, she thought she was settling something. She thought she was drawing a line between the way things were supposed to be done and the way I'd done them. What she didn't understand was that the line had already been drawn. Not by her, not by me, but by the results. $380,000 in documented annual savings, 2 client referrals, a relationship with Victor's company that was still growing. You can reframe a lot of things in a presentation, but you can't reframe what actually happened. That's the thing about doing honest work. It has a way of creating a record that outlasts the people trying to bury it. I didn't go into Victor's engagement looking for credit or recognition. I went in because there was a real problem that real people were dealing with every day, and I thought I could help. Ken had been telling his bosses about the dispatch to loading issue for 4 years. 4 years of being right and being ignored. When I came back with the analysis that confirmed what he already knew, I wasn't a hero. I was just someone who'd been paying attention. That's all integrity really is, most of the time. Paying attention to what's actually true and being willing to say it out loud, even when it's inconvenient. The intelligence part, the part where you do the analytical work, go over scope, spend 6 more weeks in a problem than anyone wanted you to. That only matters if you're willing to defend it. A lot of people do good work quietly and then go silent when someone challenges it publicly. I understand that instinct. It's uncomfortable to sit in a room and say, no, here's what actually happened. But the discomfort of speaking clearly is nothing compared to the cost of letting a false version of your work become the official record and the staying power. The part where you keep going when a performance review describes you as non-collaborative, and your referrals get handed to other consultants and the senior role you were hoping for seems to move further away. That's not stubbornness. It's knowing the difference between a detour and a dead end. My director was a detour. A frustrating, demoralizing 18-month-long detour, but a detour nonetheless. The work I was doing was real. The outcomes were real, and somewhere out there, the right people were paying attention. The same way I'd paid attention to Ken. Victor called me after I handed in my notice, and what he said has stayed with me. He said the partner had gotten quiet on the phone. That quiet meant something. It meant the truth had finally found the room it needed to land in. That's how it usually works. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just quietly, eventually, in a phone call someone wasn't expecting to make. I don't know what became of my director after I left. I don't need to. The story ended for me the moment I walked into Fortis and started doing the work I'd always known how to do, with people who understood why it mattered. That's the only ending worth building toward.